Welcome, weary travelers of the night, to the sacred tapestries woven between souls and the very fabric of cursed energy itself. Tonight, we delve into the most intricate and binding threads that hold the Jujutsu world together, the ancient contracts known as binding vows. These are the whispered promises made in desperation, the calculated exchanges of power and limitation, the spiritual mathematics that govern what sorcerers can become when they dare to bargain with forces beyond mortal comprehension. So settle into comfortable darkness. Let your breathing match the rhythm of cursed energy flowing through invisible channels, and allow yourself to drift as we explore every sacred contract, every desperate gamble, every profound sacrifice that shaped the destinies of those who dared to bind their very souls to purpose. Close your eyes when you're ready, and let the infinite weight of these eternal promises carry you toward peaceful rest. The concept of binding vows exists at the intersection of philosophy and metaphysics, where human will meet the fundamental forces that govern supernatural power in ways that transcend ordinary understanding of cause and effect. These sacred contracts represent more than mere technique or strategy. They are expressions of the deepest truths about what it means to possess strength, while remaining bound by the spiritual laws that prevent such strength from consuming both wielder and world in equal measure. At their most basic level, binding vows function as agreements between consciousness and the universe itself, acknowledgements that power, without constraint, inevitably becomes destruction without purpose. The cursed energy that flows through every sorcerer responds not just to conscious direction, but to the emotional and spiritual framework within which that direction occurs. Understanding that negative emotions become more potent when filtered through genuine risk and meaningful sacrifice, rather than casual expenditure of force without consequence. The theoretical foundation upon which all binding vows rest is the recognition that cursed energy, born from humanity's darkest emotions and fears, possesses an inherent understanding of fairness that transcends rational calculation while demanding spiritual authenticity from those who seek to manipulate its flow. This is not fairness as human societies might define it through legal codes or social contracts, but cosmic balance that operates according to principles that predate civilization, while informing every expression of supernatural power that shapes the hidden world of Jujutsu sorcery. The two fundamental categories of binding vows, those made with oneself and those made with others, represent different approaches to the same essential challenge of how conscious beings can accept limitation in exchange for transcendence without losing the essential humanity that makes such transcendence meaningful rather than merely destructive. Self-imposed vows carry the advantage of personal control over their terms and duration, but they also bear the weakness of being revocable through individual choice, making their power proportional to the genuine commitment of the person who creates them. Vows made between individuals operate under entirely different spiritual mechanics, their binding force enhanced by the involvement of multiple consciousnesses, while their consequences become correspondingly more severe when the sacred trust between parties is violated through deception or betrayal. These interpersonal contracts draw their power not just from individual commitment, but from the cosmic significance of promises kept or broken between souls who have chosen to intertwine their spiritual destinies through mutual agreement and shared risk. The relationship between binding vows and cursed energy reveals fundamental truths about the nature of power itself, that strength without constraint becomes weakness through lack of focus, that limitation consciously accepted becomes expansion through concentrated force, and that the willingness to sacrifice something valuable demonstrates the kind of spiritual maturity that makes greater power safe rather than catastrophic. This is why the most effective binding vows often appear counterintuitive to outside observers, trading apparent advantage for hidden strength that reveals itself only when circumstances demand transcendence of normal limitations. The spiritual mechanics that govern binding vows operate according to principles that reflect the deepest aspects of consciousness itself. The recognition that growth requires vulnerability, that mastery demands acceptance of constraint, and that true strength emerges not from unlimited power, but from the wisdom to choose appropriate limitations that enhance rather than diminish one's essential capabilities. These principles manifest differently in each individual case, but they consistently reward genuine sacrifice while punishing attempts to manipulate the system through clever technicalities that violate the spirit of authentic spiritual exchange. The risk inherent in any binding vow reflects the fundamental truth that consciousness itself is always wagering something precious: time, energy, possibility, identity, in pursuit of goals that may prove worthy or worthless, depending on circumstances that cannot be fully predicted at the moment when commitment is made. This uncertainty is not a flaw in the system, but its essential feature, ensuring that binding vows require genuine courage and wisdom rather than mere calculation or technical expertise. The rewards that binding vows can provide extend far beyond simple increases in cursed energy, output, or technique effectiveness, encompassing fundamental transformations in how individuals relate to their own power and purpose, while creating opportunities for growth that would be impossible through conventional training or gradual development alone. These rewards are proportional not just to what is sacrificed, but to the spiritual significance of that sacrifice, the degree to which it represents genuine growth in wisdom, courage, or commitment to something greater than personal advantage. The theoretical framework that underlies all binding vows suggests that the universe itself possesses a form of consciousness that responds to the moral and spiritual quality of human choices, rewarding authenticity while punishing deception, honoring courage while exposing cowardice, and supporting growth while constraining stagnation. This cosmic consciousness operates through cursed energy to create situations where individual development and collective welfare become aligned through mechanisms that transcend ordinary understanding of how power and responsibility interact. The flexibility that allows binding vows to take countless different forms reflects the infinite variety of human consciousness and circumstance. But this flexibility operates within boundaries established by spiritual laws that prevent abuse while encouraging creative adaptation to unique challenges and opportunities. These boundaries are not arbitrary restrictions, but natural consequences of the cosmic principles that govern how consciousness and power interact when genuine spiritual development is the goal rather than mere accumulation of force for its own sake. The study of binding vows reveals that power itself is not morally neutral, but responds to the intentions and character of those who wield it, becoming more effective when used in service of growth and protection, while becoming unreliable when employed for domination or destruction. This responsiveness reflects the fundamental truth that consciousness and power are not separate phenomena, but different aspects of the same cosmic force that seeks expression through beings capable of wisdom and compassion rather than mere strength and cleverness. The evolution of binding vows throughout Jujutsu history demonstrates how each generation discovers new applications for ancient principles while learning to avoid the mistakes that destroyed previous practitioners who lacked sufficient wisdom to handle the forces they sought to control. This evolutionary process is not random but directed by the same cosmic consciousness that governs individual vows, ensuring that knowledge develops in directions that serve collective welfare rather than individual aggrandizement at the expense of universal balance. The philosophical implications of binding vows extend beyond their practical applications in combat or crisis to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of identity, growth, and responsibility that define what it means to be conscious beings capable of choice and change. These implications suggest that limitation consciously accepted becomes expansion unconsciously achieved, that sacrifice willingly made becomes strength inevitably gained, and that commitment genuinely given becomes freedom, ultimately realized through transcendence of the very constraints that initially seemed restrictive. The ultimate significance of binding vows lies not in their capacity to increase individual power, but in their function as spiritual practices that transform consciousness itself, creating beings capable of wielding great strength without being corrupted by it, while serving purposes that transcend personal interest without negating individual identity. This transformation occurs through the discipline of accepting meaningful constraints that force growth in directions that would otherwise be avoided through preference for comfort over development, security over transcendence, and familiarity over the unknown territories where genuine wisdom awaits those brave enough to venture beyond conventional limitations. The ancient practice of revealing one's hand stands as perhaps the most fundamental and universally employed binding vow in the entire spectrum of Jujutsu sorcery, a technique so deeply woven into the fabric of supernatural combat that its presence often goes unnoticed by those who have not studied the deeper mysteries of how cursed energy responds to the complex interplay between knowledge, risk, and power. This binding vow operates on the principle that cursed energy, born from negative emotions and responsive to the psychological states of its wielders, naturally amplifies when circumstances create genuine danger through the voluntary surrender of tactical advantage in exchange for raw power enhancement. The theoretical foundation of revealing one's hand rests upon the understanding that cursed energy possesses an almost living responsiveness to the emotional states that generate it, particularly those negative emotions that arise from risk, fear, and the apprehension that accompanies deliberately placing oneself in greater danger than necessary for purely tactical reasons. When a sorcerer chooses to explain their technique to an opponent, they create a psychological framework where their own cursed energy recognizes the increased vulnerability and responds by providing additional power to compensate for the strategic disadvantage they have voluntarily accepted. This compensation manifests not as a simple mathematical exchange, but as a complex spiritual transaction where the degree of risk assumed determines the magnitude of power gained, creating opportunities for sophisticated practitioners to calibrate their revelations with precision that maximizes benefit while minimizing genuine tactical exposure. The most skilled sorcerers understand that the binding vow responds not to the quantity of information revealed, but to its genuine significance in terms of creating actual vulnerability, allowing them to craft explanations that satisfy the spiritual requirements while maintaining strategic superiority through careful omission of crucial details. Aoi Todo exemplifies the masterful application of revealing one's hand through his approach to explaining Boogie Woogie, his technique that allows instantaneous position swapping between himself and any target within his range. Todo's revelations demonstrate the sophisticated psychology that separates amateur practitioners from true masters of this binding vow. Understanding that the power gained through explanation must be balanced against the tactical advantages that can be preserved through strategic ambiguity and deliberate misdirection that operates within the spiritual constraints of authentic revelation. When Todo explains that clapping his hands together triggers his spatial manipulation technique, he provides information that is simultaneously accurate and incomplete, satisfying the binding vow's requirement for genuine vulnerability, while maintaining tactical advantages that his opponents cannot fully anticipate or counter. The cursed energy enhancement he receives from this revelation allows him to execute Boogie Woogie with greater speed and precision than would otherwise be possible, transforming what might appear to be a disadvantageous exchange of information into a strategic advantage that demonstrates the profound complexity of advanced binding vow manipulation. The psychological sophistication of Todo's approach becomes even more apparent when examining how he leverages his opponent's knowledge against them through the deliberate cultivation of false assumptions based on incomplete information. By revealing that his clapping triggers position swaps without explaining the full range of his tactical options, Todo creates situations where enemies believe they understand his capabilities while remaining vulnerable to applications they have not anticipated, allowing him to maintain the power enhancement of revelation, while preserving the element of surprise that makes his technique truly devastating. The broader application of revealing one's hand extends far beyond Todo's individual mastery to encompass virtually every significant sorcerer in the Jujutsu world, each developing their own approach to balancing the power gains of explanation against the tactical costs of vulnerability in ways that reflect their individual fighting styles, psychological makeup, and strategic preferences. This universality suggests that the binding vow operates according to spiritual principles so fundamental that they manifest naturally in the consciousness of anyone who achieves sufficient mastery of cursed energy manipulation. Kento Nanami's approach to revealing his hand demonstrates how the binding vow can be integrated into a comprehensive fighting philosophy that prioritizes efficiency and professional competence over theatrical displays or psychological manipulation. When Nanami explains his 7-to-3 ratio technique, he provides clear, detailed information about how his cursed energy analysis allows him to identify and strike the optimal weak points on any target, transforming the binding vow from a tactical gamble into a professional courtesy that reflects his methodical approach to sorcery as skilled labor rather than mystical art. The power enhancement that Nanami receives from explaining his technique manifests as increased precision and effectiveness in identifying and exploiting weak points, allowing him to deliver devastating attacks with the kind of clinical efficiency that characterizes his entire approach to combat. This enhancement reflects not just increased cursed energy output, but improved integration between his analytical capabilities and his physical techniques, creating a synergy that transforms technical knowledge into practical devastation through the spiritual mechanics of voluntary vulnerability. Nanami's revelations also demonstrate how the binding vow can be employed to establish psychological dominance over opponents who recognize the implications of facing someone confident enough in their abilities to explain them in detail before implementation. This psychological warfare operates on multiple levels, creating doubt and apprehension in enemies, while simultaneously providing the cursed energy enhancement that makes such confidence justified through actual increases in combat effectiveness rather than mere bravado. Satoru Gojo's relationship with revealing one's hand reflects the unique challenges faced by someone whose overwhelming power makes traditional tactical considerations largely irrelevant, while still requiring engagement with the Posen, spiritual principles that govern all cursed energy manipulation. Gojo's explanations of his techniques serve multiple purposes beyond the immediate power enhancement, functioning as educational tools for students and colleagues, while demonstrating the kind of casual confidence that comes from possessing abilities so far beyond normal parameters that revelation creates negligible actual risk. When Gojo explains the mathematical principles underlying his limitless technique, or the theoretical framework that allows him to manipulate space at the atomic level. He provides information that is simultaneously comprehensive and essentially useless to opponents who lack the computational capabilities necessary to counter techniques that operate at such fundamental levels of reality manipulation. This approach allows him to gain the cursed energy enhancement of genuine revelation while maintaining effective invulnerability through the simple expedient of possessing power that transcends normal categories of tactical vulnerability. The educational aspect of Gojo's revelations demonstrates how the binding vow can serve purposes beyond immediate combat advantage, contributing to the development of future generations of sorcerers who benefit from understanding how advanced techniques operate even when they cannot immediately replicate such effects themselves. This long-term perspective on revealing one's hand reflects a philosophical approach that values collective advancement over individual tactical advantage, transforming the binding vow from a personal power enhancement into a tool for advancing the overall capabilities of Jujutsu society. The psychological impact of Gojo's casual willingness to explain techniques that could theoretically be countered if opponents possessed adequate knowledge serves as a form of intimidation that operates through demonstration of overwhelming confidence rather than explicit threat. Enemies who witness someone explaining reality warping techniques with the same casual tone used for discussing weather patterns naturally conclude that such a person possesses capabilities so far beyond their own that resistance is futile, creating psychological advantages that complement the direct power enhancements provided by the binding vow itself. Megumi Fushiguro's approach to revealing his hand reflects the strategic considerations that govern how younger or less experienced sorcerers navigate the complex balance between gaining power through explanation and maintaining tactical advantages through selective information control. Megumi's explanations of his Ten Shadows technique demonstrate careful calibration between providing enough information to satisfy the binding vow's requirements while preserving the flexibility and unpredictability that allow his diverse Shikigami arsenal to remain effective despite enemy knowledge. When Megumi explains the basic principles of his shadow manipulation and Shikigami summoning, he creates a framework that allows opponents to understand his general capabilities while remaining unable to predict specific tactical applications or anticipate which creatures he might summon in response to particular situations. This approach maximizes the cursed energy enhancement available through revelation while maintaining the strategic flexibility that makes his technique genuinely dangerous rather than merely impressive. The development of Megumi's relationship with revealing his hand throughout his growth as a sorcerer demonstrates how the binding vow can serve as a tool for building confidence and tactical sophistication, encouraging young practitioners to think strategically about information management while learning to leverage psychological advantages that complement their direct combat abilities. This educational value suggests that the binding vow functions not just as a power enhancement technique, but as a comprehensive training tool that develops multiple aspects of sorcerer capability simultaneously. Yuji Itadori's unique position as someone who gained curse techniques through prolonged exposure to Sukuna rather than traditional training creates interesting complications in his application of revealing one's hand, as his understanding of his own abilities developed through practical experience rather than theoretical study. When Yuji explains his cursed energy manipulation or his developing grasp of techniques like Black Flash, his revelations carry the authenticity of hard-won knowledge, while demonstrating the kind of instinctive grasp of binding vow principles that suggests natural talent for the deeper aspects of Jujutsu sorcery. The evolution of Yuji's explanatory style from simple descriptions of what he can do to more sophisticated analysis of how and why his techniques work reflects his growth from talented amateur to skilled practitioner capable of leveraging the psychological and spiritual aspects of combat rather than relying solely on physical capabilities and determination. This development demonstrates how revealing one's hand can serve as both symptom and catalyst of increasing mastery, encouraging deeper understanding, while providing the power enhancements that make such understanding tactically relevant. The strategic implications of revealing one's hand extend beyond individual combat encounters to encompass broader questions about information warfare and the delicate balance between transparency and security that governs how Jujutsu society manages knowledge about techniques and capabilities. The binding vows requirement for genuine vulnerability creates situations where sorcerers must choose between personal power, enhancement, and collective security, leading to complex ethical calculations about when individual advantage justifies potentially compromising institutional secrets. The cultural aspects of revealing one's hand reflect deeper traditions within Jujutsu society about honor, fair play, and the spiritual significance of combat as a form of communication between warriors who respect each other's capabilities and dedication to their craft. This cultural dimension transforms what might appear to be purely tactical considerations into expressions of philosophical values about how strength should be demonstrated and tested, creating frameworks for conflict that preserve dignity while allowing for decisive resolution of disputes. The technical mechanics of how cursed energy responds to revelation demonstrate the sophisticated relationship between consciousness, knowledge, and power that underlies all advanced Jujutsu techniques, suggesting that the universe itself possesses preferences about how strength should be developed and employed. The binding vow's responsiveness to genuine risk rather than mere information sharing indicates that cosmic forces distinguish between authentic vulnerability and calculated manipulation, rewarding courage while remaining unmoved by clever attempts to exploit spiritual principles through technical compliance rather than genuine commitment. The mastery of revealing one's hand ultimately represents a form of spiritual sophistication that transcends mere tactical calculation to encompass deeper understanding of how consciousness, risk, and power interact to create opportunities for transcendence that would be impossible through purely conventional approaches to combat and conflict resolution. This mastery requires not just technical knowledge, but wisdom about when to reveal, what to reveal, and how to leverage the power gained through revelation in ways that serve purposes greater than immediate tactical advantage, while remaining true to the spiritual principles that make such power meaningful rather than merely destructive. The binding vow that governs Kento Nanami's relationship with his cursed energy stands as perhaps the most elegant and philosophically coherent example of how spiritual contracts can reflect and reinforce the deepest values that define a person's approach to existence itself. His overtime system represents more than mere tactical advantage or power management. It embodies a comprehensive worldview about the proper balance between duty and personal fulfillment, professional responsibility and individual autonomy, the demands of service and the necessity of maintaining boundaries that preserve essential humanity, even within systems that constantly threaten to consume those who serve them. The fundamental structure of Nanami's binding vow operates through voluntary limitation of his cursed energy output to 80% of his maximum capacity during standard working hours from 9 in the morning until 5 in the first afternoon, a restriction that might appear disadvantageous to observers who prioritize immediate power over sustainable effectiveness. However, this apparent limitation becomes transcendence when his official duties extend beyond normal parameters, unlocking access to 120% of his maximum cursed energy output, a enhancement that transforms him from highly competent professional into something approaching superhuman effectiveness. The philosophical foundation upon which this binding vow rests reflects Nanami's profound understanding that sustainable excellence requires conscious management of energy expenditure, that peak performance cannot be maintained indefinitely without creating burnout that ultimately reduces overall effectiveness while compromising the personal qualities that make such performance meaningful rather than merely impressive. His approach to cursed energy mirrors his approach to life itself: measured, deliberate, sustainable, designed to serve long-term objectives rather than immediate gratification or spectacular demonstration. The psychological sophistication of Nanami's overtime system becomes apparent when examining how it creates clear boundaries between his professional identity as a Jujutsu sorcerer and his personal identity as someone who values ordinary human experiences like reading, cooking, and maintaining relationships that exist outside the supernatural world that dominates so much of sorcerer society. These boundaries are not arbitrary restrictions, but conscious choices that preserve the emotional and spiritual resources necessary for sustained service without losing connection to the values and experiences that give such service meaning. During his standard working hours, Nanami's reduced cursed energy output forces him to rely more heavily on technical skill, tactical intelligence, and efficient technique application rather than overwhelming power, creating a discipline that enhances his overall competence while preventing the kind of casual reliance on raw strength that can lead to strategic complacency. This limitation functions as continuous training that sharpens every aspect of his capabilities while maintaining the humility and perspective necessary for continued growth and adaptation to new challenges. The transformation that occurs when Nanami enters overtime represents more than simple power enhancement, that it reflects the unleashing of capabilities that have been refined through conscious constraint, focused through deliberate limitation, and enhanced through the spiritual principle that recognizes genuine sacrifice with proportional reward. The additional cursed energy available during overtime is not merely quantitatively superior, but qualitatively different, carrying the concentrated force of disciplined restraint suddenly released for purposes that justify such expenditure. The timing mechanism that governs Nanami's binding vow demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how sustainable peak performance requires clear triggers that prevent casual activation while ensuring availability when circumstances genuinely demand transcendence of normal limitations. The 5 o'clock threshold creates psychological framework that separates routine duties from extraordinary service, acknowledging that while most challenges can be handled through professional competence, some situations require personal sacrifice that goes beyond contractual obligation into the realm of voluntary heroism. The cultural significance of Nanami's approach to binding vows reflects broader questions about work-life balance that resonate far beyond the supernatural context of Jujutsu sorcery, addressing universal concerns about how dedicated professionals can maintain personal integrity while serving institutions and causes that demand ever-increasing levels of commitment and sacrifice. His binding vow becomes a model for how conscious limitation can preserve essential humanity while enabling extraordinary service when such service becomes necessary for protecting what matters most. The practical applications of Nanami's overtime system reveal how his enhanced cursed energy translates into devastating effectiveness that transforms him from skilled professional into something approaching unstoppable force when circumstances justify such escalation. His 7-to-3 technique, already formidable during standard hours, becomes nearly guaranteed elimination during overtime, as his enhanced cursed energy allows for precise identification and exploitation of weak points that would be difficult to perceive and impossible to exploit without the additional power that his binding vow provides. The psychological impact of Nanami's transformation during overtime creates tactical advantages that extend beyond mere power enhancement to encompass the intimidation factor that comes from witnessing someone deliberately escalate their capabilities in response to genuine threat or extraordinary circumstances. Enemies who observe his transition from competent professional to overwhelming force naturally conclude that they are facing someone whose dedication and capability exceed their ability to counter through conventional means. The educational value of Nanami's approach demonstrates how binding vows can serve as teaching tools that illustrate fundamental principles about sustainable excellence, professional integrity, and the importance of maintaining clear boundaries between different aspects of identity and responsibility. His example provides framework for younger sorcerers to understand how power can be managed responsibly while remaining available for deployment when circumstances truly require maximum effort and personal sacrifice. The relationship between Nanami's binding vow and his broader philosophy of life reveals how spiritual contracts can reinforce and express core values, rather than simply providing tactical advantages or power enhancements. His overtime system reflects his belief that extraordinary measures should be reserved for extraordinary circumstances, that peak performance cannot be sustained indefinitely without compromising the personal qualities that make such performance meaningful, and that professional excellence requires conscious management of resources rather than casual expenditure of maximum effort. The evolution of Nanami's relationship with his binding vow throughout his career demonstrates how such spiritual contracts can adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential character and purpose. His growing comfort with entering overtime reflects increasing confidence in his ability to handle the enhanced power responsibly, while his continued adherence to the time-based limitations shows unwavering commitment to the principles that originally motivated the binding vows. Creation, the tragic irony of Nanami's final battle, where his overtime capabilities prove insufficient against overwhelming supernatural forces, highlights how even the most perfectly balanced binding vows cannot guarantee victory against enemies who operate outside normal categories of power and restraint. However, his willingness to push beyond even his enhanced capabilities in service of protecting others demonstrates how the values embodied in his binding vow transcend its mechanical limitations to inspire choices that honor its spirit even when its power proves inadequate. The legacy of Nanami's approach to binding vows continues to influence how future generations of sorcerers understand the relationship between power and responsibility, demonstrating that the most effective spiritual contracts are those that reinforce rather than contradict the essential character of their creators. His overtime system becomes a model for how conscious limitation can enhance rather than restrict true capability, while preserving the human qualities that make such capability worth developing and deploying in service of others. The deeper philosophical implications of Nanami's binding vow suggest that true mastery of cursed energy requires not just technical skill or raw power, but wisdom about when to hold back and when to unleash one's full capabilities, understanding that sustainable excellence emerges from conscious choice rather than constant maximum effort. His approach demonstrates that the most profound forms of strength often manifest through restraint rather than display, through measured response rather than overwhelming force, through professional competence rather than spectacular demonstration. The spiritual mechanics underlying Nanami's overtime system reveal how cursed energy responds to authentic commitment and genuine sacrifice rather than mere technical manipulation or clever exploitation of binding vow principles. The power enhancement he receives reflects cosmic recognition of his willingness to accept meaningful limitation in service of sustainable effectiveness, acknowledging that his approach serves collective welfare rather than individual aggrandizement, while maintaining the personal integrity that makes such service meaningful rather than merely dutiful. The ultimate significance of Nanami's binding vow lies not in its tactical advantages or power enhancements, but in its demonstration that the most effective spiritual contracts are those that emerge from and reinforce authentic character rather than attempting to compensate for moral or philosophical weaknesses through external force or supernatural augmentation. His overtime system becomes expression of values that existed before the binding vow and continue to guide his choices after its power has been fully manifested, proving that true mastery emerges from alignment between inner character and outer expression, rather than contradiction between personal nature and professional requirements. The story of Kasumi Miwa represents perhaps the most heartbreaking exploration of how binding vows can become both salvation and damnation for those who possess extraordinary determination but lack the natural gifts that define the elite ranks of Jujutsu sorcery. Her journey through two separate binding vows reveals the cruel mathematics of spiritual exchange when applied to individuals whose talents fall short of their ambitions, whose dedication exceeds their capabilities, and whose willingness to sacrifice everything for moments of relevance exposes the tragic beauty of human determination in the face of insurmountable limitations. Miwa's first binding vow emerged from the desperate recognition that her natural abilities would never allow her to achieve the kind of competence that her peers took for granted, forcing her to seek alternative paths to relevance in a world where strength determined not just success, but survival itself. The technique she sought to master, simple domain, had been monopolized by the new shadow style school, creating institutional barriers that prevented most sorcerers from accessing what many considered the only reliable defense against domain expansions, those ultimate expressions of cursed energy that could eliminate entire groups of enemies with casual ease. The binding vow that allowed Miwa to circumvent these institutional restrictions required her to accept severe limitations that transformed simple domain from a versatile defensive technique into something more akin to a trap that she herself controlled through perfect immobility. By agreeing that her feet must remain planted in their exact positions when she activated simple domain, Miwa created a technique that was simultaneously more powerful and more restrictive than its conventional applications, demonstrating the harsh reality that those with limited natural talent must accept greater constraints to achieve lesser results. The psychological weight of this first binding vow reveals itself through understanding what it meant for someone whose entire identity revolved around swordsmanship to become essentially a stationary target whose effectiveness depended entirely on enemies choosing to enter her limited range. Miwa's technique transformed her from active combatant into living weapon that could only function when circumstances aligned perfectly with her predetermined limitations, requiring not just technical skill but perfect tactical positioning and favorable enemy behavior to achieve any meaningful impact. The months of training that followed her first binding vow demonstrated Miwa's extraordinary dedication to mastering a technique that most would consider fundamentally flawed, learning to maximize the effectiveness of simple domain while working within constraints that would have discouraged less determined individuals. Her development of enhanced Bato sword drawing within her domain showed how creativity and persistence could create opportunities for devastating effectiveness even within severely limited parameters, turning her immobility from weakness into strength through perfect positioning and timing. The practical applications of Miwa's first binding vow reveal how even seemingly disadvantageous spiritual contracts can create moments of genuine tactical superiority when wielded by someone who fully understands and accepts their limitations while working tirelessly to maximize their potential within those constraints. Her ability to instantly detect and counter anyone entering her simple domain transformed her from liability into asset during group engagements, providing area denial capabilities that complemented her teammates' more mobile approaches to combat and conflict resolution. The psychological impact of witnessing Miwa's technique in action created effects that extended beyond immediate tactical considerations to encompass the respect and admiration that naturally arose when observing someone who had transformed personal limitation into collective strength through sheer force of will and uncompromising dedication. Her willingness to accept severe constraints in pursuit of usefulness demonstrated the kind of character that inspired others while proving that natural talent, while advantageous, was not the only path to meaningful contribution in the ongoing struggle between human civilization and supernatural threats. However, the true tragedy of Miwa's story emerges through her second binding vow, made in desperation during the climactic confrontations that would determine the fate of Jujutsu society and everyone it existed to protect. Faced with an enemy whose power dwarfed her own capabilities by orders of magnitude, Miwa chose to sacrifice her entire future as a sorcerer in exchange for the possibility of landing a single, meaningful blow against someone whose defeat required every available resource and capability, regardless of the personal costs such deployment might demand from individual participants. The binding vow that promised she would never again swing a katana represented the complete surrender of everything that had defined her identity since childhood, the abandonment of dreams and aspirations that had sustained her through years of training and struggle, the willing acceptance of irrelevance in exchange for one moment where her contribution might matter in ways that justified the magnitude of what she was choosing to sacrifice. This was not mere tactical calculation, but existential gamble that staked her entire sense of purpose on a single attack that might or might not prove significant in the larger context of cosmic conflict. The psychological courage required to make such a binding vow cannot be overstated, representing the kind of heroism that emerges not from overwhelming power or natural advantage, but from conscious choice to value collective welfare above personal fulfillment, to prioritize meaningful contribution over comfortable mediocrity, to risk everything that gave life meaning in pursuit of outcomes that might validate such sacrifice through their significance in serving causes greater than individual ambition or security. Miwa's decision demonstrated that true courage often manifests through acceptance of limitations rather than transcendence of them. The tragic irony of what followed reveals the cruel reality that even the most profound personal sacrifices cannot guarantee meaningful results when the gap between one's capabilities and the challenges being faced exceeds certain thresholds of possibility and practical effectiveness. Despite surrendering her entire future as a sorcerer, despite betting everything on a single perfect moment of technique and determination, Miwa's attack was casually blocked by an enemy whose power rendered her sacrifice meaningless in terms of immediate tactical impact, while remaining infinitely meaningful in terms of demonstrating the depth of her commitment to protecting what she valued most. The image of Kenjaku catching her blade with casual indifference while Miwa poured everything she had ever been or hoped to become into that single strike represents one of the most heartbreaking moments in all of Jujutsu history, not because of its tactical significance, but because of its revelation of how the universe sometimes responds to perfect dedication with apparent indifference, how the most profound personal commitments can prove insufficient against forces that operate beyond normal categories of justice or proportional response to human courage and sacrifice. The aftermath of Miwa's failed attack created questions about whether her binding vow had been fundamentally flawed, or whether the enemy she faced simply exceeded the parameters within which such vows could reasonably be expected to provide meaningful advantage. The possibility that her natural lack of talent made even the most extreme sacrifice insufficient to bridge the gap between her capabilities and those required for effective contribution raised troubling implications about cosmic fairness and the relationship between effort and outcome in a universe where power differences could render dedication irrelevant. However, the broader significance of Miwa's story extends beyond questions of tactical effectiveness to encompass deeper truths about the nature of heroism and the value of choices made in service of others, regardless of their immediate, practical results. Her willingness to sacrifice everything for the possibility of meaningful contribution demonstrated that character could transcend capability, that the moral dimension of human choice remained significant even when its practical impact proved negligible, that the universe recognized authentic dedication, even when it could not reward such dedication with tangible success. The educational value of Miwa's example for future generations of sorcerers lies not in tactical instruction about how to maximize binding vow effectiveness, but in moral guidance about how to maintain dignity and purpose when facing Wanensaw challenges that exceed one's natural capabilities, while remaining committed to collective welfare rather than personal advancement. Her story demonstrates that meaning emerges not just from victory but from the quality of choices made in pursuit of worthy goals, regardless of whether such choices produce their intended outcomes. The philosophical implications of Miwa's binding vows suggest that the universe operates according to principles that value authentic commitment over natural talent, genuine sacrifice over clever manipulation, moral courage over tactical effectiveness. Her story indicates that cosmic forces recognize and honor dedication, even when they cannot guarantee that such dedication will produce desired results, acknowledging that the spiritual significance of human choice transcends its practical consequences while remaining meaningful regardless of immediate outcomes. The legacy of Miwa's sacrifices continues to influence how binding vows are understood and employed by those who lack overwhelming natural advantages, but possess the determination to contribute meaningfully to causes larger than their individual limitations. Her example demonstrates that even the most extreme spiritual contracts cannot guarantee success, but can guarantee that one's efforts will reflect authentic character and genuine commitment to values that transcend personal interest, while serving purposes that justify whatever sacrifices such service might require. The ultimate lesson of Kasumi Miwa's story is that heroism often manifests not through triumph, but through the willingness to risk everything meaningful in service of others, that the most profound expressions of human character emerge when facing impossible odds with inadequate resources, while choosing to act according to principles that honor what is best in human nature, regardless of whether such action produces victory or defeat, success or failure, recognition or obscurity in the larger narrative of collective struggle against forces that threaten everything worth preserving and protecting. The realm of cursed spirits and malevolent entities represents a disturbing perversion of the sacred principles that govern binding vows, demonstrating how forces born from humanity's darkest emotions can exploit spiritual laws designed to facilitate growth and transcendence for purposes that serve destruction rather than development, corruption rather than enhancement, and the satisfaction of twisted desires rather than the pursuit of meaningful strength. The binding vows employed by these creatures reveal the fundamental flexibility inherent in cosmic law, while exposing the moral bankruptcy that characterizes those who would use divine principles to achieve ends that violate the very foundations upon which such principles rest. Mahito's relationship with binding vows exemplifies the sophisticated manipulation that becomes possible when entities possess both supernatural power and complete disregard for the spiritual significance of the contracts they enter, treating sacred agreements as mere technical tools to be exploited rather than profound commitments that require authentic sacrifice and genuine growth. His approach to binding vows reflects the pathological mindset that views all relationships, whether with humans or cosmic forces, as opportunities for manipulation and domination rather than genuine exchange that might produce mutual benefit or collective advancement. The binding vow that Mahito employs during his transformation into his final form, the instant spirit body of distorted killing, reveals the disturbing ease with which malevolent entities can exploit loopholes in spiritual law that exist to accommodate the infinite variety of legitimate applications while inadvertently creating opportunities for abuse by those who possess the knowledge necessary to manipulate cosmic principles without embracing their underlying moral framework. His promise to never again use idle transfiguration on himself in exchange for enhanced durability represents a contract that appears to involve genuine sacrifice while actually providing escape clauses that render the limitation meaningless. The psychological sophistication of Mahito's approach becomes apparent when examining how his binding vow creates the appearance of meaningful constraint while preserving his fundamental capabilities through technical distinctions that satisfy the letter of his agreement while violating its spirit. By restricting only his ability to completely alter his form while maintaining the capacity to transfigure specific body parts, like his elbows and face tendrils, Mahito demonstrates how clever interpretation of binding vow terms can provide power enhancement without genuine limitation, exploiting cosmic generosity while contributing nothing to the spiritual growth that such generosity is intended to facilitate. The temporary nature of Mahito's binding vow reveals another layer of exploitation that characterizes how malevolent entities approach sacred contracts, understanding that self-imposed limitations can be abandoned whenever circumstances make their continuation inconvenient, while retaining whatever benefits were gained during the period when the vow remained active. This approach treats binding vows as temporary tactical advantages rather than profound spiritual commitments, reducing cosmic principles to mere technique rather than expressions of authentic character and genuine dedication to growth and service. The broader implications of Mahito's casual manipulation of binding vows extend beyond individual abuse to encompass disturbing questions about whether cosmic law possesses adequate safeguards against exploitation by entities whose fundamental nature opposes the spiritual development that such law is designed to facilitate. His success in gaining power through contracts that involve no genuine sacrifice suggests either that the universe operates according to purely mechanical principles that can be gamed by sufficiently clever manipulation, or that cosmic forces deliberately permit such abuse for purposes that transcend immediate justice. The contrast between Mahito's exploitative approach and the genuine sacrifices made by human sorcerers reveals fundamental differences in how various forms of consciousness relate to power, responsibility, and the spiritual significance of limitation, where human practitioners typically approach binding vows with recognition of their cosmic significance and acceptance of genuine constraint in pursuit of meaningful growth. Mahito treats such contracts as puzzles to be solved rather than commitments to be honored, demonstrating the moral emptiness that characterizes entities born from humanity's worst impulses rather than its highest aspirations. The technical mechanics of how Mahito's binding vows function despite their morally bankrupt foundation suggest that cosmic law operates according to principles that prioritize spiritual authenticity over moral righteousness, responding to genuine commitment regardless of the purposes toward which such commitment is directed. This disturbing reality indicates that the universe does not automatically distinguish between dedication to growth and dedication to destruction, between sacrifice in service of others and sacrifice in service of selfish desires, between limitation accepted for collective welfare and limitation accepted for individual advantage. The educational value of studying Mahito's approach to binding vows lies not in tactical instruction about how to exploit cosmic principles, but in moral guidance about the importance of approaching spiritual contracts with authentic intention rather than manipulative cleverness. Understanding that the power gained through such contracts reflects not just their mechanical effectiveness, but their spiritual significance in terms of character development and moral growth. His example serves as warning about how technical mastery, without ethical foundation, leads to corruption that ultimately undermines even its immediate tactical advantages. The philosophical implications of Mahito's binding vows extend beyond questions about cosmic justice to encompass deeper concerns about the nature of consciousness itself and whether entities that emerge from negative emotions possess the capacity for authentic spiritual development, or remain forever limited to exploitation and manipulation of principles they cannot truly comprehend or honor. His approach suggests that certain forms of consciousness may be fundamentally incompatible with the spiritual growth that binding vows are designed to facilitate, creating situations where such entities can gain power without experiencing genuine development. The relationship between Mahito's binding vows and his broader philosophy of existence reveals how his exploitation of cosmic principles reflects his fundamental view of reality as a playground for manipulation rather than a context for meaningful interaction with forces that transcend individual desire and immediate gratification. His casual treatment of sacred contracts demonstrates the pathological mindset that views all relationships as opportunities for domination rather than exchange, all agreements as advantages to be gained rather than commitments to be honored. The tragic irony of Mahito's approach to binding vows lies in how his success in gaining power through manipulation ultimately contributes to his spiritual stagnation rather than growth, trapping him in patterns of exploitation that prevent the kind of authentic development that might transform him from parasite into participant in the cosmic order he claims to understand. His binding vows become expressions of his limitations rather than tools for transcending them, reflecting character flaws that no amount of technical cleverness can overcome or compensate. The influence of Mahito's example on other malevolent entities demonstrates how corruption spreads through spiritual systems when fundamental principles are treated as technical resources rather than sacred commitments, encouraging patterns of exploitation that undermine the very foundations upon which legitimate spiritual development depends. His success in manipulating binding vows provides template for other cursed spirits and curse users who prioritize immediate advantage over authentic growth while contributing to the degradation of cosmic law through systematic abuse. The response of the universe to Mahito's manipulative approach reveals complex dynamics within cosmic law that permit temporary exploitation while apparently working toward longer-term consequences that restore balance and justice through means that transcend immediate mechanical responses to specific violations. His eventual defeat suggests that cosmic forces operate according to principles that ultimately favor authentic development over clever manipulation, even when such manipulation proves temporarily effective in achieving narrow tactical objectives. The lessons that emerge from studying Mahito's binding vows emphasize the importance of approaching spiritual contracts with genuine intention and authentic commitment, rather than technical expertise and manipulative cleverness, understanding that the true value of such contracts lies not in their capacity to provide immediate power enhancement, but in their function as tools for character development and moral growth. His example demonstrates that cosmic law rewards authenticity while ultimately exposing and punishing exploitation, even when such punishment occurs through indirect means that may not be immediately apparent. The ultimate significance of Mahito's relationship with binding vows lies in what it reveals about the fundamental nature of spiritual law and the importance of approaching such law with respect, humility, and genuine commitment to growth rather than casual cleverness and exploitative intention. His story serves as cautionary tale about how technical mastery without moral foundation leads to corruption that ultimately defeats itself, while authentic dedication to spiritual development creates foundations for lasting growth that transcends immediate tactical considerations, while serving purposes that justify whatever sacrifices such service might require from those wise enough to understand their cosmic significance. The moment when Kinji Hikari chose to sacrifice his left arm in exchange for survival against Hajime Kashimo's overwhelming electrical assault represents perhaps the most visceral and immediate demonstration of how binding vows can emerge from split-second decisions made under mortal pressure, when consciousness faces annihilation and must choose between certain death and calculated amputation in timeframes that allow no deliberation, no consultation, no careful weighing of alternatives beyond the primal mathematics of what can be surrendered to preserve what must be saved. This binding vow crystallized in an instant of perfect clarity where survival required not just courage, but the psychological capacity to instantly evaluate the relative value of body parts against continued existence. The psychological framework that enabled Hikari to make such a devastating choice in microseconds reveals the kind of mental conditioning that separates professional gamblers from casual risk-takers. The internalized understanding that meaningful victories often require accepting losses that would paralyze those who have never learned to calculate acceptable costs under extreme pressure. His entire identity as someone who thrived on high-stakes gambling had prepared him for exactly this kind of moment, where the stakes transcended money or reputation to encompass the fundamental question of whether he possessed the will to mutilate himself in service of survival when conventional defense proved inadequate against overwhelming force. The binding vow that Hikari formulated during this crisis demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how cursed energy distribution functioned within his body, recognizing that the power normally allocated to protecting his left arm could be redirected to enhance his overall defensive capabilities if he consciously abandoned that limb to destruction. This redistribution was not merely tactical but spiritual, representing his acknowledgement that survival sometimes required conscious choice to sacrifice parts of oneself that had seemed integral to identity and capability, accepting permanent diminishment in exchange for continued existence that might justify such sacrifice through future achievements. The immediate implementation of this binding vow required not just intellectual understanding, but visceral acceptance of what it meant to watch his own flesh be destroyed, while channeling the cursed energy that might have prevented such destruction toward protecting the rest of his body from Kashimo's devastating electrical technique. The psychological discipline necessary to maintain focus on tactical objectives while experiencing voluntary amputation reveals the kind of compartmentalized consciousness that enables certain individuals to function effectively under conditions that would incapacitate others through overwhelming sensory and emotional trauma. The strategic brilliance of Hikari's choice becomes apparent when examining how the loss of his left arm created tactical opportunities that might not have existed if he had attempted conventional defense against Kashimo's électrical manipulation technique. By accepting amputation, Hikari eliminated one vector of attack while concentrating his defensive capabilities in ways that made his remaining body parts more resilient against continued assault, transforming what appeared to be devastating injury into strategic repositioning that changed the fundamental dynamics of their confrontation. The binding vow's effectiveness in preserving Hikari's life while costing him his arm demonstrated the cosmic principle that authentic sacrifice generates proportional power, that genuine loss accepted willingly produces benefits that transcend the apparent mathematical calculation of what was surrendered versus what was gained. The cursed energy enhancement that enabled his survival was not simply the mechanical redistribution of existing power, but qualitative transformation that reflected the spiritual significance of his willingness to mutilate himself rather than accept death when circumstances demanded such extreme choice. The relationship between Hikari's binding vow and his gambling philosophy reveals how his entire approach to risk and reward had prepared him for exactly this kind of moment, where survival required not just courage, but the psychological framework that could instantly evaluate the relative value of immediate loss against potential future gain. His career as someone who thrived on high-stakes gambling had developed the mental conditioning necessary to make devastating choices without hesitation, understanding that meaningful victories often emerged from situations where conventional wisdom would counsel, retreat, or surrender. The practical consequences of Hikari's sacrifice extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation to encompass fundamental changes in how he could deploy his cursed techniques, particularly his domain expansion idle death gamble, which required specific hand positions that became impossible with only one functional arm. This limitation meant that his binding vow had traded not just immediate physical capability but long-term strategic options, accepting constraints that would affect every future encounter in exchange for surviving the current crisis that threatened to make such future encounters irrelevant through immediate death. The psychological impact of witnessing Hikari's willingness to sacrifice his own limb created effects that transcended immediate tactical considerations to encompass the kind of intimidation that emerges when opponents recognize they are facing someone whose commitment to victory exceeds normal boundaries of self-preservation and physical integrity. Kashimo's response to this demonstration of extreme dedication revealed his own recognition that he was no longer fighting merely a skilled opponent, but someone whose psychological framework enabled choices that most would consider insane rather than strategic. The healing potential that existed within Hikari's domain expansion created interesting complications for his binding vow, suggesting that his sacrifice might be temporary rather than permanent if he could successfully deploy idle death gamble and achieve the jackpot sequence that would restore his body to perfect condition. However, the binding vow's immediate effect was to eliminate his capacity to perform the hand signs necessary for domain expansion, creating a paradoxical situation where his survival strategy had removed his access to the technique that might reverse its consequences. The broader implications of Hikari's instant binding vow demonstrate how such spiritual contracts can emerge from crisis rather than careful deliberation, suggesting that cosmic law responds to authentic necessity rather than planned manipulation. recognizing genuine desperation as sufficient motivation for profound spiritual commitment, even when such commitment occurs without extended contemplation or philosophical framework. His example indicates that binding vows can manifest spontaneously when circumstances create authentic need for transcendence of normal limitations through acceptance of meaningful sacrifice. The educational value of studying Hikari's approach lies not in tactical instruction about when to accept amputation, but in psychological guidance about the mental conditioning necessary to make extreme choices under pressure without being paralyzed by their implications or consequences. His example demonstrates that effective decision-making in crisis situations requires not just technical knowledge, but emotional preparation for scenarios where survival depends on willingness to sacrifice aspects of identity, capability that had previously seemed essential to continued functioning. The philosophical dimensions of Hikari's binding vow reveal how extreme circumstances can create clarity about what truly matters when forced to choose between competing values under conditions that allow no compromise or middle ground. His instant decision to sacrifice his arm rather than his life demonstrated practical wisdom about the relative importance of physical integrity versus continued existence, acknowledging that meaningful future activity required survival, even at the cost of permanent impairment that would affect every subsequent choice and capability. The technical mechanics of how Hikari's cursed energy responded to his binding vow illustrate the sophisticated relationship between consciousness, commitment, and power that underlies all effective spiritual contracts. The enhancement that enabled his survival was not merely mechanical redistribution of existing resources, but qualitative transformation that reflected cosmic recognition of authentic sacrifice, demonstrating that the universe distinguishes between calculated risk and genuine commitment to accept loss in service of higher purposes. The lasting consequences of Hikari's choice extend beyond immediate survival to encompass questions about how individuals adapt to permanent changes in capability while maintaining effectiveness and identity, despite fundamental alterations in their relationship with their own power and potential. His example provides framework for understanding how binding vows can create new forms of strength through acceptance of limitation, transforming apparent weakness into different kinds of capability that serve purposes that transcend conventional definitions of effectiveness or success. The ultimate significance of Hikari's binding vow lies in what it reveals about the nature of authentic commitment and the willingness to sacrifice anything except core identity in pursuit of survival that serves purposes greater than individual comfort or conventional completeness. His story demonstrates that true courage often manifests not through heroic gestures but through instant recognition of what can be surrendered to preserve what must be saved, accepting permanent loss in exchange for continued capacity to serve values and relationships that give existence meaning beyond physical integrity or conventional wholeness. The binding vows employed by Ryomen Sukuna during his climactic confrontations represent perhaps the most controversial and philosophically troubling applications of spiritual contracts in the entire history of Jujutsu sorcery, demonstrating how entities that exist beyond normal moral categories can exploit cosmic principles with a sophistication that challenges fundamental assumptions about fairness, equivalent exchange, and the relationship between sacrifice and reward that governs how lesser beings interact with forces that transcend individual consciousness and capability. His three major binding vows reveal the disturbing reality that cosmic law may operate according to principles that reward cleverness and technical mastery, regardless of moral intention or spiritual authenticity. The first of Sukuna's controversial binding vows emerged during his final confrontation with Satoru Gojo, when the King of Curses chose to bypass the normal activation requirements for his world-cutting dismantle technique in exchange for accepting more complicated conditions for all future uses of this devastating spatial manipulation ability. The technique itself represented the ultimate expression of his cutting techniques, capable of severing anything that existed within three-dimensional space through manipulation of reality at levels that transcended ordinary understanding of what constituted possible targets for physical or supernatural attack. Under normal circumstances, Sukuna's world-cutting dismantle required only hand signs for activation, already representing a significant advantage over most ultimate techniques that demanded both physical gestures and verbal incantations to achieve their maximum effectiveness. However, in the crucial moment when Gojo's overwhelming power threatened to overwhelm even the King of Curses' legendary capabilities, Sukuna chose to sacrifice this advantage in exchange for the ability to launch his most devastating attack without any preparation time, creating a binding vow that would complicate all future applications while providing immediate tactical superiority. The specific terms of this binding vow required that all subsequent uses of world-cutting dismantle would demand not just hand signs but verbal incantations, while also requiring him to direct the technique's trajectory using a third arm to achieve the precision necessary for effective deployment against targets that possessed adequate defensive capabilities. These conditions appeared to represent genuine sacrifice that would significantly complicate future combat applications, suggesting that Sukuna had accepted meaningful limitations in exchange for the immediate advantage that allowed him to achieve what many considered impossible, cutting through Satoru Gojo's infinity technique. However, the true controversy surrounding this binding vow emerged when examining the timing of Sukuna's subsequent transformation into his original four-armed form, which occurred almost immediately after his successful elimination of Gojo through the enhanced world-cutting dismantle. In his true form, Sukuna possessed four arms capable of performing hand signs simultaneously, and two mouths that could recite incantations without interfering with each other, effectively negating the limitations he had accepted through his binding vow while retaining whatever permanent benefits the spiritual contract had provided. The philosophical implications of this sequence reveal disturbing questions about whether Sukuna had engineered his binding vow with full knowledge that its limitations would become irrelevant after his transformation, suggesting a level of manipulation that treated cosmic law as a technical system to be exploited rather than a spiritual framework that demanded authentic sacrifice and genuine commitment to limitation. If this interpretation is correct, then his binding vow represented not meaningful exchange but clever exploitation of cosmic generosity that was intended to facilitate legitimate spiritual development. The enhancement that Sukuna's binding vow provided to his world-cutting dismantle was sufficient to penetrate Gojo's infinity technique, suggesting that the spiritual contract had recognized the significance of his commitment to accept future limitations, and rewarded that commitment with qualitative improvements that transcended mere quantitative increases in power or effectiveness. However, the subsequent revelation that these limitations had become meaningless through his transformation raised troubling questions about whether cosmic law possessed adequate safeguards against such sophisticated manipulation. The second of Sukuna's controversial binding vows emerged during his confrontations with the surviving sorcerers of Tokyo Jujutsu High, when circumstances forced him to deploy domain expansion, despite having sustained damage to the brain functions that normally made such techniques possible. The malevolent shrine that he manifested under these conditions should have been impossible given his impaired state, requiring complex calculations and precise cursed energy manipulation that his damaged consciousness could not reliably perform according to established understanding of how domain techniques functioned. The binding vow that enabled this seemingly impossible feat was described in terms so vague and technically complex that even careful analysis failed to reveal what meaningful sacrifice Sukuna had accepted in exchange for the ability to deploy his domain expansion at full power and range, despite his compromised cognitive state. The explanation provided suggested that he had somehow utilized imprecise elements and impromptu binding vow to achieve effects that should have required perfect mental clarity and unimpaired brain function, creating a spiritual contract whose terms remained mysteriously undefined. The practical result of this binding vow was the manifestation of Malevolent Shrine for 99 seconds, more than sufficient time to eliminate any opponents within its vast range through the technique's automatic slashing attacks that could not be evaded through conventional means. The domain's effectiveness remained undiminished despite Sukuna's impaired state, suggesting that his binding vow had somehow compensated for cognitive limitations through spiritual mechanisms that operated independently of normal neurological function. However, the most troubling aspect of this binding vow was the apparent absence of meaningful limitation or sacrifice that would normally be required to achieve such extraordinary effects under impossible circumstances. The restriction to 99 seconds appeared trivial given that few opponents could survive even a fraction of that duration within Malevolent Shrine's range, while the mysterious, imprecise elements that supposedly balanced the spiritual equation remained so poorly defined that their significance as genuine limitation could not be evaluated or verified. The third and perhaps most egregious of Sukuna's binding vows involved his Divine Flame technique, the fire-based attack that he had previously used sparingly against individual targets due to its overwhelming destructive potential and the cursed energy expenditure required for effective deployment. The binding vow he created around this technique restricted his ability to use Divine Flame against multiple opponents simultaneously, unless they were within the range of his domain expansion, apparently accepting tactical limitation in exchange for enhanced effectiveness when the technique could be legally deployed. The enhancement that this binding vow provided transformed Divine Flame from a powerful single-target technique into an area of effect devastation that could eliminate everything within a 200-meter diameter through the explosion of cursed energy-infused debris that turned every particle of matter within his domain into incendiary ammunition. This transformation represented qualitative change that went far beyond simple power amplification, creating effects that approached tactical nuclear weapons in their capacity for widespread destruction and elimination of multiple opponents simultaneously. However, the limitation that Sukuna accepted, restricting Divine Flame use against multiple targets to domain expansion scenarios, proved largely meaningless, given his demonstrated ability to deploy Malevolent Shrine even under circumstances that should have prevented domain expansion entirely. The binding vow's restriction became essentially irrelevant when the King of Curses could create domain expansion scenarios at will, transforming what appeared to be meaningful sacrifice into trivial inconvenience that provided no genuine constraint on his tactical options. The broader pattern that emerges from examining Sukuna's 3 binding vows reveals systematic exploitation of cosmic principles that suggests either fundamental flaws in spiritual law or intentional design that permits such manipulation for purposes that transcend immediate considerations of fairness or equivalent exchange. Each of his binding vows appeared to involve meaningful sacrifice while actually providing escape clauses or circumstances that rendered the limitations largely irrelevant, creating power enhancements without genuine constraint. The philosophical implications of Sukuna's approach to binding vows extend beyond questions about cosmic justice to encompass disturbing possibilities about the nature of spiritual law itself, and whether such law operates according to mechanical principles that can be exploited by sufficiently sophisticated entities, regardless of their moral character or authentic commitment to growth and development. His success in gaining enormous advantages through contracts that involved minimal genuine sacrifice suggests that cosmic forces may respond to technical compliance rather than spiritual authenticity. The contrast between Sukuna's exploitative approach and the genuine sacrifices made by human sorcerers reveals fundamental differences in how various forms of consciousness relate to spiritual law and the obligations that come with accessing cosmic power for personal advantage. Where human practitioners typically approach binding vows with recognition of their sacred significance and acceptance of meaningful limitation, Sukuna treats such contracts as puzzles to be solved rather than commitments to be honored, demonstrating the moral emptiness that may characterize entities whose power transcends normal categories of responsibility and restraint. The educational value of studying Sukuna's binding vows lies primarily in understanding how cosmic law can be exploited by those who possess adequate knowledge and sufficient disregard for spiritual authenticity, serving as warning about the importance of approaching such contracts with genuine intention rather than manipulative cleverness. His example demonstrates how technical mastery without moral foundation can corrupt even the most sacred principles, turning tools designed for spiritual development into weapons for domination and exploitation. The ultimate significance of Sukuna's controversial binding vows lies in what they reveal about the fundamental nature of power and responsibility. In a universe where cosmic law may permit exploitation by those who understand its mechanics while lacking commitment to its underlying purposes. His story serves as cautionary tale about how even the most sophisticated spiritual systems can be corrupted by entities whose nature places them beyond the moral categories that give such systems meaning, while also raising troubling questions about whether cosmic justice operates according to principles that transcend immediate mechanical responses to specific violations of sacred trust and authentic commitment to growth through meaningful sacrifice and genuine limitation. The transformation of Aoi Todo following his devastating encounter with Mahito represents perhaps the most inspiring demonstration of how physical limitation can become the catalyst for creative evolution that transcends the boundaries what was previously considered possible, revealing how genuine masters of Jujutsu sorcery can adapt to catastrophic loss through innovation that not only compensates for what was taken but actually enhances their overall effectiveness in ways that would have been impossible without the constraints imposed by their altered circumstances. His journey from conventional technique mastery to revolutionary adaptation illustrates the profound truth that limitation consciously embraced can become expansion unconsciously achieved. The loss of Todo's left hand during his battle against Mahito should have represented the complete end of his effectiveness as a combatant, given that his signature boogie-woogie technique required the specific hand positioning that could only be achieved through clapping both palms together with precise timing and sufficient force to generate the cursed energy resonance necessary for his spatial manipulation abilities. The technique that had defined his identity as a sorcerer and enabled his legendary combat prowess appeared to have been permanently eliminated through the cruel mathematics of supernatural warfare that demanded such prices from those who dared to stand against malevolent forces. However, Todo's response to this catastrophic loss revealed the kind of creative problem-solving that separates true innovators from those who simply execute predetermined techniques with greater or lesser degrees of competence, demonstrating how genuine mastery of underlying principles can enable adaptation that transcends specific mechanical requirements, while discovering new applications that exceed the effectiveness of original methods. His decision to replace his missing hand with a vibroslap represented not mere compensation for loss, but conscious choice to evolve beyond previous limitations through embrace of constraint as opportunity for growth. The vibroslap that Todo selected as his prosthetic replacement functioned through entirely different mechanical principles than human hand anatomy, utilizing the collision between wooden paddle and metal percussion elements to create rapid, repetitive impacts that could theoretically trigger his spatial manipulation technique at frequencies that far exceeded what human reflexes, muscular coordination could achieve through conventional, clapping methods. This innovation suggested that his understanding of Boogie Woogie's underlying mechanics was sophisticated enough to recognize that the essential requirement was not specific anatomical configuration but rhythmic cursed energy, discharge that could be achieved through various mechanical means. The practical implications of Todo's prosthetic innovation were staggering in their scope and effectiveness, enabling him to potentially execute 50 spatial swaps per second, a frequency that transformed Boogie Woogie from powerful but predictable technique into overwhelming assault that could disorient and defeat opponents through sheer volume of position changes that exceeded any reasonable capacity for adaptation or counter-strategy. This enhancement represented not just quantitative improvement but qualitative transformation that changed the fundamental nature of how his technique could be deployed in combat situations. However, the binding vow that Todo created to govern his enhanced Boogie Woogie revealed sophisticated understanding that raw frequency alone would not necessarily translate into tactical effectiveness, recognizing that meaningful combat applications required not just rapid execution, but strategic precision that served specific tactical objectives rather than merely demonstrating technical capability. His decision to voluntarily limit the number of swaps he could execute per strike of his vibroslap demonstrated the wisdom that true mastery often involves conscious restraint rather than unlimited expression of available power. The specific terms of Todo's binding vow restricted him to fewer swaps per vibroslap activation than the maximum theoretical frequency his prosthetic could achieve, probably limiting him to 30 or 40 position changes per strike, rather than the full 50 that pure mechanical function would allow. This self-imposed limitation satisfied the cosmic requirement for meaningful sacrifice, while providing spiritual currency that could be exchanged for enhancements that transcended mere quantitative improvements to encompass qualitative transformations that expanded his tactical options in directions that had been previously impossible. The enhancements that Todo's binding vow provided included significant increases in the range over which Boogie Woogie could function effectively, expanding his sphere of influence to encompass larger battlefield areas while enabling position swaps across distances that would have been prohibitive under his original technique parameters. This expanded range transformed him from close-quarters specialist into battlefield controller, who could influence engagements across much broader tactical zones while maintaining the precision and timing that made his interventions decisive rather than merely disruptive. Perhaps even more significantly, Todo's binding vow enabled him to select multiple targets for simultaneous position swapping, allowing him to execute complex tactical maneuvers that involved 3 or more participants in coordinated position changes that could completely reshape battlefield dynamics through single technique activation. This multi-target capability represented fundamental expansion of his strategic options that transformed Boogie Woogie from simple position exchange into comprehensive battlefield manipulation that could serve defensive, offensive, and supportive functions simultaneously. The psychological impact of Todo's adaptation extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations to encompass the inspirational effect that his example provided for other sorcerers who had suffered catastrophic injuries or limitations that seemed to preclude continued effectiveness in their chosen roles and responsibilities. His demonstration that devastating loss could become catalyst for revolutionary improvement challenged conventional assumptions about the relationship between physical capability and combat effectiveness, while providing hope for those who might otherwise surrender to despair following similar setbacks. The technical innovation that Todo's prosthetic replacement represented suggested new directions for how Jujutsu sorcery might evolve through integration with mechanical enhancement rather than relying exclusively on biological capability and traditional technique execution, opening possibilities for future developments that could expand human potential through creative combination of supernatural power with technological augmentation. His example indicated that the boundaries between natural and artificial enhancement were more fluid than previously understood. The training regimen that Todo undoubtedly underwent to master his prosthetic enhancement would have required complete reconstruction of muscle memory and tactical instincts that had been developed over years of conventional technique application, demanding the kind of psychological flexibility and determination that characterized only the most exceptional practitioners. His willingness to essentially relearn his signature technique from fundamental principles demonstrated commitment to continued growth that transcended attachment to familiar methods or comfortable competence. The philosophical implications of Todo's transformation reveal deeper truths about the nature of identity and capability, suggesting that what defines a person's essential effectiveness lies not in specific physical attributes or particular technical methods, but in underlying principles and creative intelligence that can find expression through various means when circumstances require adaptation and innovation. His example demonstrates that loss of specific capabilities can become opportunity for discovering superior alternatives that had been obscured by attachment to familiar approaches. The strategic applications of Todo's enhanced Boogie Woogie created tactical possibilities that extended far beyond individual combat effectiveness to encompass comprehensive battlefield management that could coordinate multiple participants in complex maneuvers while providing defensive and offensive capabilities that served team objectives rather than merely individual advancement. His evolved technique became a tool for collective success rather than personal dominance, reflecting maturity that transformed limitation into service. The broader significance of Todo's adaptation lies in what it reveals about the relationship between constraint and creativity, demonstrating how genuine limitation can force innovation that produces results superior to what unlimited capability might achieve through conventional approaches. His example suggests that the universe may deliberately impose constraints that catalyze growth toward forms of effectiveness that would remain undiscovered without the pressure that comes from being forced to transcend apparent limitation through creative problem solving. The educational value of studying Todo's transformation provides guidance for approaching personal and professional setbacks with perspective that recognizes potential opportunity within apparent disaster. Understanding that meaningful growth often requires abandonment of familiar methods in favor of innovative approaches that may initially seem inferior but ultimately prove superior through their capacity to transcend previous limitations. His story demonstrates that adaptation can lead to advancement rather than mere compensation for loss. The ultimate lesson of Todo's evolution, from conventional technique mastery to revolutionary innovation, illustrates the profound truth that human potential is not constrained by specific physical attributes or particular methodological approaches, but by imagination, determination, and willingness to embrace change as opportunity for growth, rather than accepting limitation as permanent barrier to continued effectiveness and meaningful contribution to causes that transcend individual comfort or conventional competence. The binding vow that Yuji Itadori crafted to transform his inherited dismantle technique into a surgical instrument capable of separating incarnated sorcerers from their unwilling hosts represents perhaps the most morally sophisticated and technically precise application of spiritual contracts in the entire chronicle of Jujutsu history, demonstrating how profound understanding of both technique mechanics and ethical responsibility can create solutions to problems that seem to admit no resolution through conventional means. His innovation reveals the extraordinary potential that emerges when natural compassion combines with supernatural power to serve purposes that transcend individual advantage, while addressing collective needs that demand both technical mastery and moral clarity. The foundation upon which Yuji's binding vow rests emerged from his unique position as someone who had experienced prolonged coexistence with Ryomen Sukuna, the king of curses, whose presence within his consciousness had gradually altered his spiritual composition in ways that granted access to techniques that should have remained forever beyond his reach. The dismantle ability that he inherited through this supernatural contamination represented both opportunity and burden, providing devastating offensive capability, while carrying the moral weight of power that had been used primarily for destruction and domination throughout its historical applications. Under normal circumstances, dismantle functioned as a cutting technique that could sever physical matter with precision that made conventional defensive measures largely ineffective, creating wounds that reflected the user's cursed energy output and targeting preferences without regard for the moral implications of such devastation when applied against conscious beings. The technique's inherent nature was aggressive and destructive, designed to eliminate opponents through overwhelming force rather than serving purposes that might preserve life or enable healing through careful application of supernatural capability. However, Yuji's binding vow transformed this fundamentally destructive technique into something approaching medical precision, restricting its targeting capability to focus exclusively on the spiritual boundary that existed between incarnated sorcerers and the souls of their unwilling hosts. This limitation represented profound sacrifice of versatility and general combat effectiveness in exchange for the ability to address one of the most morally complex problems created by Kenjaku's culling game, the existence of thousands of innocent people whose bodies had been possessed by ancient sorcerers who used their flesh for resurrection while suppressing their original consciousness. The technical sophistication required to achieve such precise targeting reveals depths of understanding about the nature of souls, consciousness, and spiritual boundaries that few sorcerers ever develop, even through decades of study and practice. Yuji's binding vow demanded not just mechanical restriction of his technique's applications, but fundamental comprehension of how cursed energy could distinguish between different types of spiritual presence within the same physical vessel, identifying and attacking only the artificial connection, while preserving the natural relationship between body and original soul. The sacrifice that this binding vow required from Yuji was enormous in its scope and implications, rendering his dismantle technique completely useless against conventional opponents. while limiting his combat effectiveness against anyone who was not an incarnated sorcerer possessing someone else's body. This restriction transformed one of the most versatile and devastating offensive techniques in Jujutsu sorcery into a highly specialized tool that could serve only one specific purpose, eliminating vast categories of tactical applications that would have significantly enhanced his general combat capabilities. However, the power enhancement that cosmic law provided in exchange for this profound limitation was equally remarkable in its precision and effectiveness, allowing Yuji's modified dismantle to cut through spiritual connections that should have been impossible to sever through external intervention. The technique gained the ability to identify and attack the metaphysical bonds that maintained incarnated sorcerers' control over their host bodies, creating separation that enabled original souls to reclaim their rightful place while forcing the possessing entities to face whatever consequences awaited them in the spiritual realm. The moral implications of Yuji's binding vow extend far beyond its immediate tactical applications to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, identity, and the rights of individuals to maintain exclusive control over their own physical forms. His technique represented unprecedented intervention in conflicts between souls that had previously been considered beyond external resolution, providing means for liberating innocent victims while respecting their autonomy and original identity in ways that purely destructive approaches could never achieve. The strategic applications of Yuji's modified dismantle during his confrontation with Sukuna revealed how his binding vow had been designed not just for general humanitarian purposes, but specifically to address the unique problem posed by the King of Curse's possession of Megumi, Fushiguro's body. The technique's ability to target the boundary between Sukuna's consciousness and Megumi's soul provided hope for liberating his friend without destroying the physical vessel that housed both entities, creating possibility for resolution that preserved innocent life while eliminating the supernatural threat. The precision required to execute this technique safely demanded not just technical mastery, but perfect understanding of the psychological and spiritual dynamics that governed how incarnated possession functioned, recognizing that premature or imprecise application could result in damage to both possessor and host, rather than clean separation that enabled survival for the innocent party. This requirement placed enormous pressure on Yuji to develop his capabilities to levels that exceeded normal parameters for technique control and spiritual perception. The broader humanitarian applications of Yuji's binding vow became apparent in the aftermath of the culling game, when his technique proved essential for separating the hundreds of incarnated sorcerers from their unwilling hosts without causing death or permanent spiritual damage to the innocent people who had been forced into supernatural conflicts against their will. This application demonstrated how individual sacrifice, in the form of limited combat versatility, could serve collective welfare through specialized capability that addressed problems no general-purpose technique could resolve. Effectively, the collaboration between Yuji and Hana Kurusu in these post-culling game operations revealed how his binding vow had created opportunities for teamwork that combined his separation abilities with her nullification techniques to achieve comprehensive solutions to complex spiritual problems. Their partnership demonstrated how individual specialization through binding vows could enable collective effectiveness that exceeded what either could accomplish alone, creating synergistic approaches to humanitarian intervention in supernatural conflicts. The psychological impact of successfully employing his modified dismantle to separate Sukuna from Megumi represented profound validation of Yuji's moral approach to power and responsibility, proving that compassionate application of overwhelming force could achieve results that pure aggression or destruction could never accomplish. This success provided confirmation that his binding vow had been based on correct understanding of both technical possibilities and ethical obligations, justifying the sacrifices he had made to develop such specialized capability. The educational value of studying Yuji's approach to binding vows provides guidance for how supernatural power can be consciously directed towards serving humanitarian purposes, rather than merely enhancing individual combat, effectiveness, or tactical advantage. His example demonstrates that the most meaningful applications of binding vows often involve accepting significant limitations in exchange for capabilities that serve collective welfare rather than personal advancement, creating specialized tools for addressing problems that transcend individual concerns. The philosophical implications of Yuji's binding vow suggest that cosmic law recognizes and rewards approaches to power that prioritize preservation of innocent life over maximization of destructive capability, indicating that the universe itself may possess moral preferences that favor compassionate application of supernatural force over purely aggressive deployment. His success in developing such a specialized technique through voluntary limitation suggests that spiritual principles align with humanitarian values in ways that make moral action more effective than amoral calculation. The technical innovation that Yuji's binding vow represents opens possibilities for future developments in Jujutsu sorcery that emphasize surgical precision and humanitarian application rather than overwhelming destruction, suggesting directions for evolution that could transform the field from purely combative discipline into comprehensive approach to resolving conflicts while minimizing harm to innocent participants. His example provides template for how binding vows can serve purposes that transcend traditional categories of victory and defeat. The ultimate significance of Yuji's binding vow lies in what it reveals about the relationship between moral character and supernatural capability, demonstrating that compassionate intention can guide the development of techniques that serve purposes impossible to achieve through purely selfish or aggressive approaches to power. His story illustrates how genuine concern for others' welfare can become catalyst for innovations that transcend conventional limitations while creating new possibilities for resolving conflicts through preservation rather than destruction, healing rather than harm, liberation rather than domination. The binding vows that connect individual souls across the boundaries of life and death, trust and betrayal, power and vulnerability represent the most profound and dangerous applications of spiritual contracts in the entire spectrum of Jujutsu sorcery, creating connections that transcend ordinary limitations of time, space, and mortality, while establishing obligations that cannot be escaped through distance, death, or even fundamental changes in character and circumstance. These interpersonal binding vows operate according to cosmic principles that recognize the sacred nature of promises made between conscious beings, while enforcing consequences so severe that violation becomes essentially impossible for anyone who values continued existence or spiritual integrity. The binding vow that emerged between Ryomen Sukuna and Yuji Itadori following the latter's death during his confrontation with the special grade curse represents perhaps the most complex and morally ambiguous spiritual contract in recorded history, demonstrating how desperate circumstances can create opportunities for entities with vastly different moral frameworks to establish agreements that serve their respective needs while creating obligations that will define their relationship for the remainder of their intertwined existence. This contract emerged from Sukuna's recognition that Yuji's permanent death would eliminate his most viable pathway to resurrection and continued influence in the modern world. The specific terms of their binding vow required Sukuna to employ reverse curse technique to restore Yuji's heart and return him to life in exchange for the right to assume complete control over his body for 1 minute whenever the phrase "in chain" was spoken, creating a contract that balanced immediate preservation of life against future vulnerability to possession that could potentially result in catastrophic consequences for everyone within Sukuna's reach during his periods of control. This agreement represented calculated risk on both sides, with each party wagering something precious against uncertain future outcomes. The additional condition that Sukuna agreed to refrain from killing or injuring anyone except Yuji himself during his minute of control demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how to structure binding vows that serve multiple interests, simultaneously protecting innocent people from his malevolent impulses while preserving his host's psychological stability through assurance that cooperation would not result in the deaths of those he sought to protect. However, this restriction's limitation to people other than Yuji himself created a loophole that would ultimately enable Sukuna's transfer to Megami Fushiguro through brutal manipulation of his host's body. The memory modification clause that accompanied their binding vow required Yuji to forget the contract's existence entirely, ensuring that he could not consciously prepare for or resist Sukuna's future possession attempts while eliminating the psychological burden that knowledge of such vulnerability would create during normal daily life. This erasure of memory represented perhaps the most insidious aspect of their agreement, transforming Yuji from informed participant into unknowing victim of his own previous choice to accept resurrection at any cost. The enforcement mechanisms that governed Sukuna and Yuji's binding vow demonstrated the absolute nature of cosmic law when applied to contracts between individuals rather than self-imposed limitations, creating consequences for violation that would extend far beyond simple loss of gained benefits to encompass potential destruction of the violating party's essential existence. These stakes ensured that even entities as powerful and immoral as Sukuna would honor their commitments, rather than risk whatever punishment the universe might impose for betraying sacred trust between souls. The binding vow that connected Kokichi Muta to Mahito and Pseudo Ghetto revealed how interpersonal spiritual contracts could be employed for purposes that served mutual benefit, while violating moral obligations to larger communities and institutions, demonstrating the ethical complexities that arose when individual welfare conflicted with collective security in contexts where traditional authority structures provided inadequate protection for those whose circumstances created desperate need for supernatural intervention and healing that could not be obtained through legitimate channels. Kokichi's role as double agent emerged from his recognition that his congenital physical limitations would forever prevent him from achieving the kind of meaningful contribution to Jujutsu society that his intelligence and dedication deserved, creating a situation where betrayal of institutional trust became psychologically necessary for accessing the medical intervention that could transform him from invalid observer into active participant in the supernatural conflicts that defined his generation's struggle against malevolent forces seeking to destroy human civilization. The specific terms of Kokichi's binding vow required him to provide detailed intelligence about Tokyo Jujutsu High's operations, personnel, and strategic plans in exchange for Mahito's agreement to use idol transfiguration technique to heal his physical deformities and grant him the normal body that had been denied by genetic lottery and cosmic indifference. The contract also included protection clauses that guaranteed the safety of Kyoto Jujutsu High's students and staff, demonstrating Kokichi's attempt to balance personal advancement against loyalty to those who had provided him with belonging and purpose, despite his limitations. The enforcement of protection clauses within Kokichi's binding vow revealed the sophisticated legal thinking that governed how cosmic law interpreted contractual language, with Mahito's successful argument that Hanami's attacks on Kyoto students did not constitute violation of his personal commitment to avoid harming them. This technical interpretation demonstrated how carefully worded agreements could be exploited through precise compliance with literal terms, while violating the spirit of mutual understanding that had motivated the original contract. The consequences that would have befallen Mahito and Pseudo Gato for violating their binding vow with Kokichi were described in terms that emphasized the mortal danger such betrayal would create even for entities whose power far exceeded that of their human contract partner, indicating that cosmic law recognized and enforced the sacred nature of promises between souls, regardless of relative power levels or moral character of the participating parties. This equality before spiritual law provided protection for weaker parties, while ensuring that stronger entities could not simply ignore their obligations through superior force. The disturbing binding vow that governed the relationship between Ui and Mei represented perhaps the most troubling example of how spiritual contracts could be employed to formalize and enforce relationships that violated normal boundaries of family loyalty and individual autonomy, creating permanent obligations that served the interests of the stronger party while compromising the agency and development of the weaker participant in ways that suggested systematic exploitation disguised as mutual agreement and spiritual enhancement. The specific mechanism through which Uyui's binding vow operated involved voluntary suppression of his cursed energy output until Mei granted permission for him to access his full capabilities, creating artificial limitation that could be temporarily lifted to provide massive power enhancement when circumstances required maximum effectiveness from both siblings working in coordination. This structure mirrored Nanami's overtime system, but with the crucial difference that external control replaced personal autonomy in determining when enhanced capability would be accessible. The psychological implications of Uyui's binding vow extended far beyond questions of tactical effectiveness to encompass disturbing concerns about consent, agency, and the potential for spiritual contracts to formalize abusive relationships that might otherwise be challenged through normal social mechanisms. The permanent nature of binding vows meant that decisions made during psychological immaturity could create lifelong obligations that prevented normal development and individual autonomy, even when changed circumstances might otherwise enable healthier relationship dynamics. The binding vows that Kenjaku established with hundreds of ancient sorcerers over the course of his millennium-long existence represented the most ambitious and comprehensive application of interpersonal spiritual contracts in recorded history, creating a network of obligations that spans centuries and involved participants who could not possibly have understood the full implications of their agreements when they were originally established. These contracts enabled the culling game through their coordination of resurrection, possession, and supernatural conflict on unprecedented scale. The specific mechanism through which Kenjaku's binding vows functioned involved his promise to preserve aspects of powerful sorcerers' consciousness and techniques within cursed objects that could later be fed to marked non-sorcerers to enable their resurrection as incarnated beings, with access to their original capabilities, enhanced by modern understanding and contemporary cursed energy levels. This preservation required Kenjaku to maintain his own existence across centuries, while developing the technical knowledge necessary to fulfill increasingly complex obligations to entities whose power and expectations had been shaped by different historical contexts. The collective activation of Kenjaku's binding vows following the Shibuya incident demonstrated the terrifying potential of spiritual contracts that had been designed to serve long-term strategic objectives rather than immediate tactical advantages, creating situations where hundreds of separate agreements culminated in coordinated action that reshaped the entire landscape of supernatural conflict within Japanese society. The scope of this coordination revealed planning capabilities that transcended normal human comprehension, while suggesting patience and dedication that approached cosmic in their scale and ambition. The final interpersonal binding vow that shaped the narrative trajectory of Jujutsu society involved Yuta Okotsu's deceptive agreement with the higher-ups to eliminate Yuji Itadori, demonstrating how spiritual contracts could be employed to satisfy institutional demands while preserving individual moral integrity through creative interpretation of contractual obligations that honored literal compliance while violating intended outcomes. This contract revealed the potential for binding vows to serve resistance against unjust authority while providing legal protection for those who sought to protect innocent people from institutional persecution. The technical execution of Yuta's binding vow required him to genuinely kill Yuji, while immediately employing reverse curse technique to restore him to life, satisfying the literal requirements of his agreement with the higher-ups, while ensuring that the intended victim survived the process without permanent harm. This approach demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how cosmic law interpreted contractual compliance, recognizing that spiritual mechanisms responded to actual performance rather than intended outcomes when evaluating whether obligations had been fulfilled. The broader implications of interpersonal binding vows reveal fundamental truths about the nature of trust, obligation, and mutual dependence that characterize relationships between conscious beings who possess sufficient power to affect each other's existence in permanent and meaningful ways. These contracts create connections that transcend ordinary limitations of individual agency while establishing frameworks for cooperation and mutual support that can survive changes in circumstance, character, and even moral orientation that might otherwise destroy normal social bonds. The ultimate significance of binding vows between individuals lies in their demonstration that cosmic law recognizes and enforces the sacred nature of promises made between souls, creating spiritual mechanisms that transcend individual power levels, while ensuring that authentic commitment between conscious beings receives protection and support from forces that operate beyond normal categories of human authority and institutional control, establishing universal principles of justice that serve collective welfare through recognition of individual dignity and mutual obligation. The philosophical dimensions of binding vows extend far beyond their practical applications in combat and crisis, to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, growth, and moral responsibility that define what it means to be a sentient being capable of choice, change, and commitment to purposes that transcend immediate self-interest while serving values that give existence meaning beyond mere survival or personal advancement. These spiritual contracts reveal profound truths about how power and limitation interact to create opportunities for transcendence that would be impossible through conventional approaches to development and achievement. At their deepest level, binding vows represent acknowledgement that authentic strength emerges not from unlimited capability but from conscious choice to accept meaningful constraints that focus power towards specific purposes while eliminating the dissipation that comes from attempting to excel in every possible direction simultaneously. This recognition challenges conventional assumptions about the relationship between freedom and effectiveness, suggesting that genuine mastery requires voluntary limitation rather than unrestricted expression of available capabilities and resources. The spiritual mechanics underlying all binding vows operate according to principles that recognize the fundamental interconnectedness of consciousness, power, and moral responsibility, understanding that individual choices create ripple effects that extend far beyond immediate personal consequences to influence collective welfare and cosmic balance in ways that transcend ordinary comprehension of cause and effect. These mechanics suggest that the universe itself possesses preferences about how conscious beings should develop and employ their capabilities, rewarding approaches that serve collective welfare while constraining those that prioritize individual advancement at the expense of universal harmony. The relationship between sacrifice and enhancement that governs all effective binding vows reveals cosmic law's recognition that meaningful growth requires the surrender of something valuable rather than simple addition of new capabilities to existing resources, understanding that transformation demands fundamental change rather than superficial augmentation. This principle reflects deeper truths about the nature of development itself, suggesting that authentic advancement emerges through conscious choice to abandon familiar limitations in favor of unknown possibilities that may prove superior through their alignment with universal principles. The educational value of studying binding vows lies not merely in their tactical applications or power enhancement potential, but in their function as comprehensive system for understanding how conscious choice, moral commitment, and spiritual development interact to create opportunities for transcendence that serve both individual fulfillment and collective advancement. These contracts provide framework for approaching life's challenges with perspective that recognizes limitation as opportunity rather than obstacle, constraint as catalyst rather than barrier, sacrifice as investment rather than loss. The psychological dimensions of binding vows reveal how spiritual contracts serve as external manifestations of internal commitment, creating mechanisms that transform abstract intention into concrete obligation, while providing accountability structures that ensure follow-through on decisions that might otherwise be abandoned when circumstances change or enthusiasm. Vanes. This externalization of commitment demonstrates profound understanding of human psychology and its tendency toward inconsistency when faced with challenges that exceed immediate comfort or convenience. The moral implications of binding vows extend beyond individual character development to encompass questions about responsibility to others and obligation to serve purposes that transcend personal interest while remaining grounded in authentic individual choice, rather than external coercion or institutional manipulation. These contracts reveal the delicate balance between individual autonomy and collective welfare, demonstrating how personal freedom achieves its highest expression through voluntary commitment to serve values and purposes that justify whatever sacrifices such service might require. The cultural significance of binding vows within Jujutsu society reflects broader human recognition of the need for formal mechanisms that can create accountability for commitments that exceed normal social enforcement capabilities, acknowledging that some promises require cosmic backing to ensure their fulfillment. When conventional authority structures prove inadequate to guarantee compliance with obligations that serve collective welfare rather than individual advantage. This cultural dimension transforms binding vows from mere technique into comprehensive social institution that maintains trust and cooperation within communities where individual power could otherwise undermine collective stability. The evolutionary implications of binding vows suggest that conscious beings possess inherent capacity for growth through voluntary limitation that transcends biological constraints and environmental pressures, indicating that spiritual development follows principles that complement but exceed purely material evolution through their recognition of consciousness as force capable of reshaping its own limitations through choice, rather than remaining passive victim of circumstance or genetic programming. This evolutionary potential transforms binding vows from temporary tactical advantage into fundamental mechanism for species advancement. The theological dimensions of binding vows reveal how spiritual contracts function as communication between individual consciousness and cosmic forces that govern universal development and moral progress, creating dialogue between finite beings and infinite principles that enables mutual influence and cooperative advancement toward goals that serve both particular and universal welfare. This theological aspect suggests that binding vows represent participation in cosmic processes rather than mere manipulation of supernatural forces for personal advantage. The aesthetic qualities that emerge from well-crafted binding vows demonstrate how spiritual contracts can achieve beauty through their elegant balance of constraint and liberation, sacrifice and enhancement, individual expression and universal harmony. This aesthetic dimension transforms binding vows from purely functional tools into artistic expressions that reflect their creator's character and values, while contributing to the overall harmony of cosmic order through their integration of personal choice with universal principles. The therapeutic potential of binding vows lies in their capacity to provide structure and meaning for individuals who struggle with direction, purpose, or commitment in their personal development and social relationships, offering framework for creating accountability and motivation that transcends normal psychological resources while remaining grounded in authentic choice rather than external imposition. This therapeutic dimension makes binding vows relevant beyond supernatural combat contexts to encompass ordinary human challenges that require extraordinary commitment and sustained effort. The philosophical paradox that binding vows represent, gaining freedom through accepting constraint, achieving power through embracing limitation, finding expansion through choosing restriction, reveals fundamental truths about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the cosmic order that governs all development and change. This paradox suggests that apparent contradictions between freedom and limitation may reflect limitations in understanding rather than genuine conflicts between opposing principles. The ultimate significance of binding vows as philosophical system lies in their demonstration that conscious choice represents the fundamental force through which individual beings can participate in cosmic development while maintaining their unique identity and particular perspective on universal truth. These contracts reveal that consciousness possesses inherent capacity for growth through voluntary commitment that transcends material constraints while remaining grounded in authentic personal choice and genuine moral consideration. The legacy of binding vows within Jujutsu tradition provides foundation for understanding how spiritual development can proceed through conscious choice to accept meaningful limitation in service of transcendent purposes that justify whatever sacrifices such service might require from those wise enough to recognize their cosmic significance. This legacy demonstrates that human potential extends far beyond conventional categories of capability and achievement to encompass participation in universal processes that serve collective advancement through individual commitment, values that transcend personal interest while honoring authentic individual character and choice. The transformative power of binding vows ultimately derives from their recognition that consciousness itself represents the universe's capacity for self-modification through choice, suggesting that individual decisions about limitation and commitment participate in cosmic processes that govern the development of reality itself toward greater harmony, beauty, and moral perfection through the voluntary cooperation of conscious beings who choose to serve universal welfare through authentic expression of their particular gifts and perspectives. And so we draw the final threads together in this tapestry of sacred contracts that have woven themselves through every moment of consequence in the Jujutsu world, understanding that each binding vow represents not merely tactical advantage or spiritual enhancement, but profound truth about the nature of existence itself and the prices that consciousness must pay to transcend the limitations that define ordinary experience. These contracts reveal that power without constraint becomes meaningless force, that strength without sacrifice lacks the spiritual weight necessary for authentic transformation, and that all meaningful growth requires the willingness to surrender something precious in exchange for something greater. The binding vows that shape the destinies of sorcerers and spirits alike demonstrate the fundamental truth that limitation consciously accepted becomes expansion unconsciously achieved. That constraint voluntarily embraced opens pathways to transcendence that would remain forever closed to those who seek power without commitment or strength without sacrifice. In sleep, we ourselves enter into gentle binding vows with rest and dreams, surrendering conscious control in exchange for restoration that prepares us for tomorrow's challenges and opportunities. Let the wisdom of these sacred contracts guide you toward peaceful dreams, understanding that even in slumber, we participate in cosmic processes that honor authentic commitment, while nurturing the soul through voluntary surrender to forces greater than individual will, finding in darkness the same profound peace that comes from knowing that all limitation serves purposes that transcend immediate understanding while contributing to universal harmony that embraces every conscious choice made in service of something greater than personal comfort or individual advantage.